Hello, I'm back again. You see before you my father and my mother. There is one of the 10 Commandments that says, "Honor thy father and thy mother." And I was watching a documentary not too long ago, and there was a rabbi on it who quoted another older and very prominent rabbi as saying that of all of the 10 Commandments, the commandment to honor thy father and thy mother is perhaps the most difficult to uphold. And when I heard that, I remembered a parable that I had heard many years ago, and it always stuck with me. And it's set in biblical times in the land of Israel. And there's a vineyard and a family that has lived on it for many generations. There's a house, which is little more than a hut. Various trees around, of course. Off in the distance, the sheep, the goats, etc. But in the front, not really yard, but the courtyard, the front area of the house, some dozen or so feet away, is a large tree that isn't a vine tree, a production tree. It's more of a shade tree. And here the family has lived for generations, and there's the elderly father, and there's the son who is maybe 16 or 17 or so, and they get into a tremendous argument and a big fight, and they start wrestling, and of course the son is now stronger than the father, and throws the father down to the ground and starts dragging him along, and drags him away from the house. And as he's passing this ancient shade tree, the father suddenly shouts in a very different tone of voice, says, "Stop! Stop!" And the son is startled, and he turns and he says, "Why?" And the father says, "Because I only dragged your father this far." And it's a marvelous vignette of this sort of age-old conflict between fathers and sons, and sometimes between mothers and daughters, and between sons and mothers, and daughters and fathers. It's age-old in human nature. I have at this time a son who's 18, and he's soon to graduate from high school. He's very dedicated to baseball. He's selected his college, and he's going on to it. And I would say it was almost 2 years ago that he basically signaled that he had little further use for me. It coincided pretty much with when he got his driver's license. And I sort of stepped back, and I said to myself, well, in fact I said this to him as I walked into his car, his mother's car. We've gotten divorced in 2004, that was some 7 years ago. And in another video I probably will discuss many aspects of that, but that's not the subject for this video. But I turned to him and I said, "Henry, it's clear to me the eagle has flown, and I don't want to be an old eagle with a tether holding you around the talon, holding you back, but I want you to know that the old branch will always be here for you to land on in case you feel the need to." And he hasn't, and I suspect he probably never will. But as I walked away from the car at that time, I thought back to myself. I had pulled away, certainly. My career in theater, which I discussed in the video that I made just before this one, certainly was not anything that my parents expected I would do, and indeed was not anything that they valued. And which was somewhat painful, but I became so immersed in that I hardly noticed. When we came to Europe on our tours, my mother came to see actual show in Stuttgart, but my father did not come. My father came to see Dikers I. He was traveling on business for the Pentagon, as you can tell by his photograph. I'm looking at the monitor, I get it all reversed. He was a naval officer, career naval officer, and at the time he was assigned to the Pentagon, and he had been a nuclear submariner in fact, commander of a nuclear missile submarine. He was a graduate of the Navy Nuclear Power School in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and was one of Rickover's men, for Admiral Rickover. And once he finished his time in sea duty, and specifically in the submarine service, he transferred over, and he was on the Naval Policy Office, Op 61, and then on the staff of the Secretary of Defense during the SALT talks. Then in 1980 he became the United States Naval Attaché to Paris. He had prepared diligently for knowing the French during his time in the Pentagon, and as a result of this he was one of the ideal people to escort French nuclear scientists to various American nuclear installations, including the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in Berkeley. And there was a rather delicate diplomatic dance that went on in those days, which I only learned about many years later, that it turns out he was participating in. And so while he was in San Francisco in the Bay Area on one of these visits, he saw my first production, Dykers the First, in the deconsecrated church that had become the Intersection Arts Center. And although he was very polite about it, I'm sure he thought I had made the mistake of my life. And nothing I did thereafter until I went to law school and became a clerk for a federal judge and then joined a major firm, acted to remedy that decision or that assessment that he had. So when I came to Stuttgart with my last show and my biggest production, he didn't come. And he was at the time attending a French business school. He had retired from the Navy in 1984. And he said that he had an assignment that had to get done. I left it at that. My mother came. We went on a cruise on the Rhine afterwards. My father then joined us in Heidelberg, and we had a marvelous time in Switzerland after that. And as I've said before, I came to Paris many, many times and still do go to Paris since those days. But the subject really for this sequence of the videos that I'm preparing relates more to the relations of parents and children and how they can try to understand each other, how they misunderstand each other. One point that I think is important to make, almost always the father is the money earner, and so the father has to go out into the world as a young man before being married, before having children, and select one of the broad institutions of society in which to pursue a career, and then within that, narrower and narrower choices. So for example, my father chose the military, he chose the Navy, he chose the submarine service, and then he switched over to the diplomatic political side. And these choices have effects on our personalities and our characters. In order to be successful within an institution or within an organization, within a broad institution, you have to develop the personal habits, attributes, proficiencies within your own character that enable you to be successful within that field and among the people who are your superiors in that field, and also, as you rise, your subordinates. And the habits of personality, the talents of personality, when you enter into it, when you're 15, 16, 17, you're like a field with a vast variety of plants growing upon it, new growing plants. And depending on the field that you choose, certain of them are nourished and emphasized, and certain are ignored or perhaps actively suppressed. And so as you do that, if you're successful, certain aspects of your personality and your character develop and become more and more prominent, and other aspects diminish. Now, within that milieu, of course, is also the time and place in which you are born. My father was born in the early 30s. He was a boy during World War II. He was just graduating from high school at the time the Korean War happened. So he is in many ways a product of the 1940s and the 1950s. I was born in 1955, and I came of age, as perhaps you've already seen, I haven't videoed them yet, had a very diverse, extensive life experience across America, very much raised within the military world, and then at age 14, I was sent to boarding school at St. Albans in Washington, D.C. This is my graduation photograph. Right in the midst of the height of the protests against the Vietnam War. And those had become protests against the military, the particular military institutions that we had, and then even more broadly, the very importance of having a military, of having within yourself and growing within yourself the attributes of a military persona. For those young people, a few years older than me, I was just a couple of years young enough that the draft was ended before I came of age to be drafted. But for those who deeply objected to the Vietnam War and wanted to refuse the draft, to dodge the draft, out of protest for that, they were faced with a moral dilemma. Are you not, in some respect, obligated to comply with the moral judgments your society has reached through the democratic process? The entry into the Vietnam War was approved by the Congress, the Senate, and the President. And what gives you the right to disagree with the general consensus society has adopted? And certainly you can find a basis for that. Henry David Thoreau was all about that. But what is your basis? And in the late 60s and early 70s, in order to find a moral basis for refusing to serve in that war, the Vietnam War, and for defying the draft, it was natural to adopt the position that being a military person, being military-minded, is itself inherently deficient in a fundamental way. So that when you are refusing to be drafted to go to Vietnam, you aren't doing it out of self-interest, or some people may charge you with cowardice. You don't want to go to this steaming jungle and be blown up in a booby trap. They say it's just personal weakness on your part, and you say, no, 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 it is part of a philosophical assessment that I, in my superior wisdom, have made that justifies me and causes me to reject you and to reject your positions and your attitudes. And this judgment was that the military is not only unnecessary, but somehow a fundamental defect in human character. Now, this is what I encountered when I came to St. Albans. But it was I came first of all from a background, and I haven't videoed this yet, but perhaps you've already seen it, very, very deep roots in the military. One of the major generals of the Revolution, General John Stark of New Hampshire, is a direct ancestor of mine. Above me, I've put a number of hats. This is my grandfather Winslow, which is her father. This was his hat that he wore during the First World War. He was a lieutenant and then captain of engineers. He received a divisional citation for bravery at the Second Battle of the Marne because his unit was stationed precisely where the Germans opened their attack. And his unit was subjected to heavy shelling. His commanding officer was almost immediately severely injured, had a leg torn off. A couple of other officers were killed, and suddenly Francis Winslow III was in command. And I'm going to video. He received a letter, very deeply troubling letter from the mother of one of the soldiers under his command who was killed. And I have that original letter, and I will read that to you and go through many other original documents that he had from his time in combat in World War I. His own father, Francis Winslow II, was a career naval officer. His father, my grandfather's grandfather, Francis Winslow I, was also a career naval officer. He died on active duty in the Civil War. He was a blockader. And he did not die in combat, although he was in combat several times. But he was one of the thousands upon thousands who died of disease. He was felled by a mosquito. He died of yellow fever just out of Key West while on blockade duty during the Civil War. And even before that, Daniel Todd Patterson, the naval commander in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, is another direct ancestor. And it goes very, very deep in American history, in my family. On my father's side, my father, of course, a career naval officer. His father was a career naval officer. This is my father's hat as a captain. And I have other hats. I don't have a hat of his father, but it's identical to that one because he also was career Navy. And there were my father's father on his mother's side was a graduate of West Point, class of 1886, the same class as General Pershing. And I will acquaint you with many details. He fought in the Boxer Rebellion in China. He fought in the Philippine insurrection. He was for a year the secretary of the provincial government over the Moro province in the Philippines. In the book America the Great that I've been writing and hope to finish soon, I spend a lot of time on the Philippines and discussing the American role in the Philippines, beginning with the Spanish-American War and thereafter. So when I arrived at St. Albans, into the midst of the anti-war fervor, I came with that background. Furthermore, my classmates at St. Albans included many sons of many top-level political figures. The most notable today, one of my classmates was Neil Bush. He's the younger brother of President Bush II, son of President Bush I. Another classmate was Mark Percy. He was the son of Senator Charles Percy of Illinois. Another classmate was Henry Richardson. He was the son of Elliot Richardson, who has received a lot of praise in history for, during the Watergate scandals, refusing to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Before Elliot Richardson was Attorney General, he was Secretary of Defense. Before that, he was Secretary of what was then called Health, Education, and Welfare. Today, roughly speaking, the Department of Health and Human Services. I went to a party at the Richardson's house during those times, and when I walked in, there was a large cake that happened to be there on the table, a white cake with icing, and done in icing on the surface of it was the seal of the Department of Defense. And that was pretty notable. Elliot Richardson himself was sitting in the library. He looked up and said a very friendly hello, his feet on the divan. And as I think back on it, that cake must have come from a going-away party or some sort of a celebration. I suppose he had just been transferred from the Department of Defense to the Department of Justice. So I came into this milieu. Oh, and there were others. The son of Milo Gélan, the son of Philip Gélan, who was the head of the editorial pages of the Washington Post. Another classmate was David Albert. He was the son of Carl Albert, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives at that time. So I entered a political world, or at least it was filled with the sons of high-level political figures. And I was a boarding student, although my grandmother and my aunt lived close by, and in fact my other grandparents also lived close by. I was, of course, living on the campus right next to the National Cathedral for all week, and often on the weekends, although many times I went to my Grandma Brinny's house, my mother's mother, for weekends. I saw the protests. The student newspapers, as well as the national newspapers, were filled with reports of the moratorium on Washington. I observed demonstrations, although, as I'm sure I have said in other videos that I will shoot later, I was then and have been for several decades an observer of American life rather than a participant. It's only relatively recently that I felt properly and adequately prepared to become a participant. But I would go to demonstrations to observe them. I've smelt tear gas. I've seen the people running around. I've seen the police with their batons. And this was happening while my parents were back in Bremerton, Washington, because when we left Hawaii in 1969, first the family went to Bremerton, Washington, and then I came over here to, I knocked off my sign, to Washington, D.C. Excuse me. This is what happens when you don't rehearse. Hope that's working. One of the lessons George Coates taught me was you rehearse everything. And that came to the fore in the production of Rare Area that I was talking about in the video I just made. As I mentioned, we had scheduled to do 2 weeks, 10 performances in a 400-seat theater at Zellerbach Hall, the Zellerbach complex of theaters at UC Berkeley. And then they transferred it. They said, that's closed, but you can have the big theater for no increase in rent. We jumped at the chance. We performed in the great big theater. It was magnificent. Opening night, the cast, it's a wonderful performance. The audience loves it. The cast comes forward. And shortly before that, George and his girlfriend and now wife, Colleen, had turned to me and said, Ed, you're the producer. You should take the flowers to Catherine Neal, because when you have a soprano and it's opening night, it is a marvelous tradition that someone comes forward and gives flowers to the soprano. And so they said, Ed, you do that. And I said, that's great, I'd love to. So the audience is applauding. I come out, I'm holding the bouquet of flowers, I go up to Catherine Neal, I give her the bouquet, and then I decide I will just step back and applaud as well. And I start walking backwards, and poof! I went right off the edge of the stage. Boom! And it could have been a real disaster, because in the big theater, there's an orchestra pit, and that could have been all the way down. As it happens, it wasn't, but it was a drop of about 3 feet or so. So I just vanish. The entire audience is dead, suddenly goes dead silent, and I'm down on the floor, and I immediately say, I'm all right, folks! And then I popped up, and I started applauding. And everyone in the audience, the people came up afterwards, and they all thought that this had been planned by George, had been directed by him, and I let them think so. But of course, it was a complete accident. And afterward, then George came up to me and he says, Ed, you see why you rehearse everything? Everything. And I said, I've learned that one, George. And then people in the cast and the crew would come up and they'd say, Ed, are you all right? Are you all right? And I said, well, I think I fractured my check writing hand. I don't think I'll be able to write any paychecks. But of course, I was being silly, and aside from some slight soreness in my left hand, there was no problem at all. Anyway, so that little vignette triggered by my knocking my little sign off. Now, what was I talking about? St. Albans, the protest era. So I arrived in this milieu of the great antagonism to the military, to the political establishment. In the fall of '69, Nixon had been president only for, I guess, about a year, maybe less than a year. And, you know, in the St. Albans world, that was by no means unpopular. As I mentioned, you know, we had a Bush son there, and we had other conservatives, but also liberals, and Democrats, certainly, Carl Albert's son. And, but at St. Albans itself, there was a move afoot to establish a new constitution for the student body. I have the student newspapers from that time right over here. I may take a moment in one of these videos and pull them out. So we ourselves were voting for a new constitution for the school, for the student body. Of course, course, there was a debate club. It's called the Government Club. They were debating the issues of the war and peace. And meanwhile, my family is off in Bremerton, Washington, on a Navy base, having just come from Honolulu, which was quite insulated from all of this. And Bremerton is across Puget Sound from Seattle. And my father's submarine was undergoing overhaul and conversion to a new kind of missile. So while my brothers and my parents were having a really delightful and secluded family life together, I was off boarding student in the middle of Washington during all of these protests and upheavals. I also had an uncle who was had been a theater producer and in fact had owned, until very recently, the building that then became the Fillmore East, the famous Fillmore East promoted by Bill Graham. And while my uncle, Roger Euster, owned that theater, he had produced Timothy Leary and poet Allen Ginsberg and many radical groups and rock and roll groups. So he was before even Bill Graham in a certain extent. Roger also had a legitimate theater called the Little Theater, where he presented the world premiere of Tambourines to Glory by Langford, oh, I'm going to get this wrong, Langford Wilson or Langford Hughes, I'm sorry about that. And so he was very involved in the alternative world. So I had my father, the nuclear submarine commander. In fact, in August of '69, I'd been on a cruise on the submarine for about 5 hours. So we were submerged. I walked among the missile compartments, touching the tubes of the missiles. In one of my videos I'll show you various photographs of these things. And within 6 months I was at the Fillmore East, sitting in the audience listening to Eric Clapton. He was with Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. Wilbert Harrison performed, Seals and Crofts performed. My cousin Karen was the one who took me there, 2 years older than me, very attractive. I have posters, photographs, etc. that I expect I will be showing you in another video. And we, of course, went to a coffee house in Greenwich Village. So I saw that world up in New York. I saw the protest world in Washington. But I would go home on vacations to the military world on a Navy base. With parents who were both Goldwater Republicans. And then I would go back to the Washington world. And I was young, 14, 15, 16, and so I wasn't really integrating all of this, but I was recognizing that there's something troubling here, but also very interesting. How can these two worlds, so different, that I am intimately connected with, be developing within the same country at the same time? And so it was at about that time, in fact it was a bit earlier, but it was cemented at that time, that I decided that I wanted to learn. I was going to observe and try to soak up all of this, not to judge anyone, nor either to commit myself as an intimate, committed participant in any of these particular worlds, sub-worlds of America, but to be open to all of them, to inquire, to ask, and then as I received answers or simply observed people, to simply soak it in, take it in, to collect it, like a device that is collecting data. And I began that process. That's when I decided that really I would dedicate myself to writing, and also, as it happens, to filmmaking, because my Aunt Laura early on recognized my interest. I, in fact, had been borrowing her 16mm camera to try to make some films, and she had some very old 8mm cameras from her father and mother when they used to make videos in the 20s and the 30s even, and we hauled out the old projector and watched some of them. And she bought me a Super 8 camera that was just wonderful, a Pallid Bolex, very beautiful design, and so I was making 8mm movies with those. And so that's what I thought I would do, and focus on that. And so when I shouldn't go, the real theme here is fathers and sons, children and parents. So I'll take that story in its continuation later on. But so here was my milieu, and here was my assessment of what I was interested in. Another thing I had learned very early on was that I hated to take orders of any kind, and I really didn't have any passionate desire to give orders either. I also found that I had no particular desire to acquire credentials or praise. I did, but it was simply an aspect of my curiosity. I had in the 5th grade in Los Lomitas School in Menlo Atherton, California, Menlo Park. I'd been tested in 5th grade, and I didn't quite understand what that was all about, but they took me out of class and had me do some tests, and later on then I had another meeting with the lady, and she said, you know, you are refuting all of our theories because you have been to so many different schools. And I will show in another video all the many different schools across the country that I went to. You've been to so many different schools. Sometimes you've been to 2 different schools on different parts of the country within the same year. And we expected that this would so disrupt your learning ability that you wouldn't be too good here, but instead you're very good. And therefore you're refuting our tests. Then in 6th grade, we had to do a science report. I chose the human body, and I teamed up with one of my 2 best friends, a guy named Billy Rainbolt, and the way we divided it up was he said he would take the stomach and the digestive system, and I would do all the rest. And so I did a report called The Body, and it covered the nervous system, the blood system, the lymphatic system, the bones, respiration, pretty much everything else, the brain. And I loved doing that report. And then when we did the presentation to the class, we had a sort of an overhead projector. This is 1967, 66, 67 after all. And I'm laying all these out and I'm telling all about it. And after it was all over, the teacher took me aside and she said, "Did you notice how totally focused they were on you?" And I said, "No, I was just explaining, you know, what I had studied and was reporting on." And she says, "You have a talent for teaching." She said, "Oh, that's interesting." Then we went off to Hawaii, to Iolani School, and again in science class. In this class, the way the seats were laid out in a grid, there were 4 rows. And the teacher, this is 8th grade, the teacher said that the top 4 students academically would have the front row seats in each of these 4 rows. So I was in one of the front row seats. And then he said that each of the students in the front row will prepare a test on one of the subjects that we've covered. So my assignment was astronomy. So I prepared the test that everyone was to take on astronomy, and then I graded it. And no one got 100%. I made sure that it would be tough. And the kid who did best got 98%. And the average was about 65. And the teacher told me I needed to round up. I needed to scale it so that the average would be 70. And so I came up with a mathematical formula and basically raised each kid's grade by a certain percentage so that the total grade would average 70. I had just been studious and curious, and I know if you watch lots of television shows that focus on grade school and middle school and high school, you'll see the science-minded nerdy guy get picked on a lot. I never got picked on. The best I can say, and most of you seeing this probably won't know this name, but Encyclopedia Brown was a character. There are books written for middle schoolers, and kind of simple language, simple plots, etc. And I devoured those things. One of the recurring characters was Encyclopedia Brown, and he was the smart kid in class, and he would solve, you know, detective-type mysteries, you know, who stole the eraser from the chalkboard, or whatever they were. And and nobody ever picked on Encyclopedia Brown, and nobody ever picked on me. So everything had gone very smoothly. Then I'm in the St. Albans world, the political world, the social upheavals of the late 60s. I arrived at St. Albans in '69. And so this required a lot of thought and a lot of focus, and it was troubling to me to try to integrate these different themes. Well, in the meantime, my father is a highly successful, trusted, responsible career Navy officer who has been charged with the command of a nuclear missile submarine ever since 1968, 69. He would go on these deterrent patrols. Before that, he was on attack submarines. He was what was called a plank owner, which means part of the commissioning crew, the first Navy crew that takes a warship. He was a plank owner of the nuclear attack submarine Shark. Now, the Shark was exactly the same design as the Scorpion, which later was lost at sea with all hands. So it was a dangerous world, a dangerous high-tech machine where everyone must perform his duty promptly, accurately, and completely, where everyone must instantly follow orders. And that was the attribute that my father had to develop in order to be successful within the money-earning, the family-supporting milieu he had chosen, which was first the American military, and then within that the Navy, within the Navy, the submarine service, and it pretty much was all nuclear submarine, but initially he had been on a diesel submarine. So he had progressively made choices that meant that it was fundamental, it was essential to him to cultivate within himself the belief that following orders is the highest moral principle. And of course, there is, with the caveat, you don't follow an illegal order, you don't, you know, all of the lessons we've learned from Nuremberg, but when the Nuremberg trials after World War II. But that aside, the principle of life that was imbued deeply into him was you follow orders, you respect the historic chain of command, the principles of command. And how was this validated? Not only by his life choices, but growing up in World War II, during the World War II period, his father, my grandfather, had been a aircraft carrier officer. He was the #2 guy and then the #1 guy for a while on the carrier Saratoga. He was an aircraft carrier commander immediately after that. He personally observed the Bikini Atoll atomic bomb tests. In the Korean War, he was an aircraft carrier commander, and in fact, as I will tell in another video, the pilots aboard his carrier, the carrier Leyte, included the first African-American combat pilot in the U.S. Navy. And that was Jesse Brown, Ensign Jesse Brown, and he was shot down and killed in action during the Korean War, which was very upsetting to my grandfather. And I have personal letters that I will read to you talking about Jesse Brown. He recommended Ensign Brown for the Distinguished Flying Cross, which is a very high award. And I will contrast that with some other reports from other officers and from one of the men who was a sergeant in the black tankers in World War II. He was a tank commander, and he had some pungent observations about Southern officers and the danger of putting a Southern white officer in command of black troops. Well, my grandfather was from Mississippi, born and bred. His father goes back a long way. And when I went through our family letters, it certainly would have been possible that sentiments would have been found there that would have been disappointing today, to say the least. Quite the contrary, I was delighted to find, and I will share those with you. But even if I didn't have the letters, we have the tangible aspect of the recommendation for the medal. Because one of the comments by the sergeant who was a commander of tanks in World War II was that one of the officers had said no black could receive a medal higher than some mid-level award. Clearly an example of prejudice, if it was actually Army policy, but certainly it was prejudice on the part of that officer. And to the extent there was such a policy, written or unwritten, held only by Southern officers or not, clearly my grandfather did not share it because he breached it in recommending such a high award for Ensign Brown. So I had this background in the military, my father had this deep appreciation for the value of adhering to long accepted traditional values for obeying orders, and found it not merely annoying as a matter of disobedience, but somehow a moral affront that someone, particularly his son, would not follow orders. Orders such as, cut your hair. And I'm still not following it, although in some of the other, I often have my hair cut. I just decided that in these videos, I happen not to have gone to the barber in a long time, and why not get some videos done with my hair, which is frankly the way I like it better, namely as it is now. But this, of course, led to conflict, because the father, and then now I reach the more general points, the father does not always have a very good picture of the milieu that the son is growing up into. My father was in Hawaii and then in Bremerton. He wasn't seeing the demonstrations. If he was, and later on he did, because he was ultimately transferred back to Washington, it would just make steam come out of his ears. How can they be doing this? I, on the other hand, was trying to understand and not judge. And also it was a milieu, a world that I needed to fit into and wanted to fit into. As with any young person growing up, if that's the shape your society is taking, you tend to want to at least fit into it. There was also an element, and this is a deeper issue, and that I think is more current to our life today. It's the issue of innovation and creativity. In the military world, innovation and creativity are valued to the extent that they produce even more effective weapons. This descends from the World War II era, invention of all of the different instruments of war that we had then, most prominently the nuclear bomb, and missiles, and so on and so forth. And so there was definitely an appreciation for science, for engineering, and for creativity within that world. But the artistic world, certainly in the 50s with the Beats, and even before that, I have a set, Robert Lowell, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, is also a member of my same Winslow family. My mother is a Winslow, and Robert Lowell is my second cousin once removed. His favorite relative, Harriet Winslow, was my great aunt, and he had been against even World War II. He'd been a conscientious objector, even as to that war. Within the American cultural world, there is, as with any group of creative people, a resistance to being ordered around, a resistance to discipline, a resistance to people saying that you have to do what other people did in the past.